So for those of you guys who might not know, I am actually a computer engineering major, which is not the same thing as computer science, don't get it twisted. And I'm sure my subscribers have had enough of me continuously putting off YouTube in order to do that thing called college, and I apologize to you guys as hard as humanly possible. But that ordeal aside, a lot of people seem to be very upset with Sonys GDC reveal of the PS5 specs, and well, not actually showing off the console or any gameplay. And to you guys I say, well, what did you expect? It's called GDC and it stands for Game Developers Conference. It's not like Gamescom or E3. Like, the only people who come here are game developers. Simply put, this conference was not made for the average Joe like you or me. But somehow people still found a way to be upset. Like, relax. While I understand your frustration, this should have been the last conference we expected an official reveal to be at. But all of that aside, I just finished watching the conference in its entirety and I can understandably see why people aren't very appreciative of what they've shown us. If you don't have a little bit of context and background knowledge, it's very easy to write off the entire conference as an hour-long lecture, which I'm not gonna lie, it was, but I'm here to break it down to you guys as simple as possible so that you can make your own educated opinion as to whether or not it was actually a waste of time. And as someone who understood, I'd say around 90% of it, because remember, I'm still a student, I think it was still a hype builder because it gave us a lot of insight as to why the PS5 might actually be better than the Xbox Series X, especially from a game development standpoint. But without further ado, here we go. I'm going to attempt to simplify the entire conference to under 10 minutes, all while comparing it to the Xbox Series X and giving my 2 cents. Okay, starting off, the entire overview of this conference can be summarized into one word, and that one word is easy. Basically, Sony wants to show developers that developing for the PS5 will be easy and not much different than what they're used to now. The goal of this conference was to demonstrate the ease of development for the PS5 while still showing that it's leagues better than the PS4 Pro. This is actually a slide Sony calls balancing revolution, which is new features and faster hardware, with evolution, keeping things similar enough that the developers don't need to go back to school to learn it again. And that's it. That's basically the theme of the entire conference and what they talk about for the majority of the hour. So if you ever find yourself getting confused at any point, just relay that theme back in your head. Making the PS5 better versus keeping it simple. That's all they're trying to explain. So continuing on, Sony spends half of the entire conference speaking on one aspect of the PS5, the SSD. And I am now going to break down the entirety of that half as simply as I can. But before we can do that, you need to first understand what an SSD is. Nowadays, computers typically only use 2 types of storage: hard drive storage HD and solid state drive storage SSD. Hard drives are old, slow, and clunky and pretty much get beat out by SSDs in every single way. Hard drives use a needle and a spinning disk to read and write stored data, which physically takes time because the parts have to move. Think of a record player. So if your CPU or graphics card ever asks for some data from your hard drive, it might be physically stuck waiting for your hard drive to find it, slowing down your entire system. Solid state drives, on the other hand, are completely electronic, way faster and more reliable. They are honestly quite similar to flash memory found in things like flash drives. Your CPU and graphics card won't have to spend as much time waiting since there are no moving parts. And to put it into perspective, Apple has been using solid state drive memory in their MacBooks since 2010, proving to you how much of a luxury it really is. And if you've ever used a MacBook, you'd know that they load up things pretty damn quick. But now that you know that an SSD is just a completely electronic, fast, and more reliable form of storage, we can now get to explaining what Sony was talking about. And in a nutshell, I've already told you, and no, I'm not joking. If we were to scale this summary video with Sony's presentation, we'd be about 12 minutes in or 25% done. So just stick with me, guys. I promise, this stuff is much simpler than they made it out to be. But continuing on, after Sony gave an overview of how SSDs work, they spent the next 10 minutes or so speaking about the benefits and issues implementing the PS5's SSD and how they overcame them. And basically they spoke of 4 benefits, and I'll list them for you right now. Number 1, in practice, the PS5's SSD should be about 100 times faster than the hard drive found on the PS4. It can achieve read-write speeds of 5 GB per second, while the PS4 can only manage 50 MB per second. And for confirmation, 5 GB divided by 50 MB is indeed 100x. Number 2, since the SSD is so fast, it should be possible to load game world textures as the player is turning around to see them, making it so that the PS5 doesn't have to work in overdrive for things that the player isn't even looking at, which will free up resources to do other things and minimize the times the player sees things before they are fully loaded in. And that basically means if you're not looking at something, it's not going to be loaded in, which will free up other resources within the PS5 and essentially make the console more powerful than it actually is, which is a pretty crazy feat of engineering and something that the Xbox Series X just can't do. Number 3, because of the SSD speed, game worlds can be more unique and hold more textures, which is pretty straightforward. And number 4, because of some fancy SSD signs I won't get into, game patches will no longer need to be installed. As soon as you download the patch, you're good to go. And that pretty much covers it for the SSD benefits they spoke about. So now onto the issues Sony faced when implementing it into the PS5 system and how they overcame them. Well, they really only ran into a single issue, and it's an issue that affects all SSDs, not just the one in the PS5. And that is, simply put, SSDs that are 10 times faster than a hard drive won't necessarily perform that way in practice because of all of these intermediary steps of data transfer that must occur. Realistically speaking, SSD that is 10 times faster than a hard drive should perform around twice as fast. Without going into the details, Sony says that their engineers were able to eliminate all of the drag that happens in these intermediary steps and truly deliver an SSD that is not only 100 times faster than a hard drive, but performs that way too. And that's pretty much it for the issues Sony faced when implementing the SSD into their system. They did speak about one more thing, however, and that's pretty much how you're going to be upgrading your storage once you get your PS5. It's not going to be as simple as just buying any old SSD and just plopping it into your PS5. There's going to be a list of Sony approved drives that you're going to have to select from, and those are going to be the only ones that are truly supported. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we are officially 25 minutes through the 50-minute presentation. I hope I'm doing a decent job breaking it down, so just bear with me, we're almost through. In the next section of the conference, Sony discusses the PS5's GPU, or graphics card. And remember that theme I told you not to forget, the balance between making the PS5 better while also keeping things simple? That theme starts to play a major role from this point on. And for those of you guys who might not know what a graphics card is, it's basically the part of a console or PC that produces the graphics you see on screen, hence graphics card. In regards to the PS5 GPU, Sony essentially talks about how they've made the GPU on the PS5 ridiculously faster than the PS4, but also kept the design similar enough that it will be able to fully support backwards compatibility for 90% of PS4 titles. Sony then goes to talk about new GPU features, in which there were 3. Number 1, primitive shaders, which despite the name doesn't have much to do with shaders at all, but instead is a technology used to render 3D objects as you need them and increase the detail in said 3D objects and particles on a dynamic basis, or basically better looking textures. Number 2, ray tracing, which will basically simulate light as it behaves in real life and use that to eliminate the in-game world instead of the more flat and fake lighting we typically get on consoles today, or basically photorealistic lighting and shadows. For a general idea of how awesome ray tracing is, this is how Minecraft looks when ray traced. Yeah, I know. And number 3, a variable GPU clock speed, which will basically allow for better resource allocation and more controlled power consumption, or basically a graphics card that only works when it needs to, conserving power and resources. And Sony seemed particularly proud of the feats that they were able to achieve with their new custom GPU, and even went as far as to take what I personally think is a direct shot at Microsoft and the Xbox Series X. This probably flew over a lot of your heads, but on these slides right here, Sony basically says, shoving more processing power into your console does not mean it will be able to be used or even be able to perform as expected, which essentially calls the Xbox Series X very ambitious but not very cost effective or innovative in its own right. Sony basically says, developers, look here, while Xbox may have theoretically built the more powerful console, it was haphazardly thrown together without any thought, but on the PS5 you will find features truly useful to you and to gamers, or basically, power means nothing if you can't use it. And that's pretty much the vibe I got from this whole section, and if I had to give my own opinion, I think they're kind of right. Sony seems to have put in a lot of thought into developing the PS5, and a lot of the features shown here today just don't seem to have any competition on the Xbox side of things. Which pretty much leads me to believe that while the Xbox is the more powerful console, the PS5 will most likely be much easier to develop for and much easier to push to its limits. And if this is in fact the case, we might actually see better looking games on the PS5 even though the Xbox Series X is stronger, very similar to how it turned out with the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X. And now we are officially 40 minutes into the 50-minute lecture, with only one more part to cover, which is arguably the simplest part. Again, hopefully I'm doing a good job at this, even if I'm not, here we go anyway. Onto the PS5's new 3D audio system known as the Tempest. Typically, how games nowadays recreate the feeling of direction in sound is by having a sound system with roughly 50 sound sources that will play through your headphones or TV. And by sound source, I mean theoretical places where the actual sound would be that your headphones then try to mimic. So when I say 50 sound sources, a good way to visualize it is to imagine that you weren't wearing headphones at all and that there were 50 little speakers scattered throughout your room trying to recreate the sound of whatever game you were playing. This obviously wouldn't be ideal for recreating sound perfectly, as sounds that are near each other sadly wouldn't be able to reserve their own speaker and instead get forced through the same source. With that being said, that obviously means that more sources means better and more realistic sound. With Sony's new Tempest technology, they aim for hundreds of sound sources, which at the very least doubles what we have today on modern consoles. These new sound sources will be significantly more advanced and should make for great sounds. The second and final thing Sony talked about in regards to their Tempest audio system is individual HRTF, or head related transfer functions. In a nutshell, every human has different head and ear shapes, so we will physically experience sound differently. Some people might hear at higher frequencies than others, and others can sometimes be numb to certain sounds. Sony has taken this into account and essentially created separate graphs for these vastly different hearing ranges on a per individual basis. These graphs are head-related transfer functions, or HRTFs, that aim to fine-tune the sound system to the type of listener you are. A good analogy would be colorblindness. You know how every game gives you a list of colorblind options that work to enhance the experience for people with colorblindness in whatever way they need it? Well, the selection of your specific HRTF, or at least one close to it, will have a similar effect. It will fine-tune the Tempest 3D audio system to your head and ears only, creating sounds that Sony says may fool you into thinking they're coming from the real world. The only difference between the selection of your HRTF and colorblind assist is that you don't need to have a disability to take full advantage of it. Everyone has a specific HRTF, and once you find it, the sound should in theory be lifelike to you. And time. Honestly, I've said all I've needed to say, and that was possibly the hardest script for a video I've ever written because of all the decisions that had to be made on what to keep and what to leave out and blah 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 blah. Anyways lads, if you liked the video, give it a like. If you dislike the dislike, I've been innocent, you've been the audience, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.